During a lot of the discussions around the in-development Aegon's Conquest spin-off, a topic that I have seen discussed a lot, even before any of the spin-offs were a thing, centers around the idea of casting. In fact, as soon as books such as The World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood began to detail the events of Aegon's Conquest in much more detail than we had seen before, fans started to talk about who they would cast in an Aegon's Conquest TV show. For a long time before we had confirmation that House of the Dragon would be covering the Dance of the Dragons, there was a significant number of fans who believed the show would be starting with the Conquest. Thus, in turn, there was lots of speculation regarding casting at this time. When you look back at the kinds of discussions, there are two very common trends that you begin to spot across different platforms, like Twitter, Reddit, and even in YouTube comments. The idea of casting Henry Cavill and Katheryn Winnick as Aegon the Conqueror and Visenya Targaryen. The trouble is, casting big budget shows, such as a Game of Thrones spin-off, is a very fine balance, and one that so far both the main show and House of the Dragon have managed to keep to. Namely, you need to be able to look past the actor to embrace and see the character. Casting more unknown or less mainstream Hollywood actors really helps to achieve this, but at the same time, big names also help shows reach a wider audience. I'm going to use Matt Smith as an example for a second. When he was cast as Daemon, I made a video defending that choice when many fans were being critical of his physical appearance not being what they had pictured, which is a fair position to take if you feel like that. But I knew from watching Smith's prior work, he had what it took to play Daemon. But I will concede that in the back of my mind, I was slightly worried I would not be able to look past the actor and not see Matt Smith. I grew up in the 90s watching classic Doctor Who with my granddad, and of course I love the 2005 revival. Doctor Who was one of my first fictional universes that I fell in love with, and in many ways, despite the downturn in quality, still is my favourite. And that was my issue with Smith. I personally associated him too much as the Doctor. To my surprise, after the first few scenes of House of the Dragon, it very much turned into a non-issue. And while when I look at Smith, I still see the Doctor, his performance is so different in House of the Dragon, it doesn't trigger that part of my brain. I think this may come down to the fact that they are both two very different characters, allowing Smith to pull from different aspects of his acting repertoire. That is the risk of casting well-established actors. They come with the association of the other roles they've played. But on the other side of the coin, it works just the same with lesser-known actors as well. Using House of the Dragon as an example, Ewan Mitchell for most is a less mainstream or well-known actor before House of the Dragon, but I associate him deeply as Osferth, the baby monk from The Last Kingdom. For me, one of the best TV shows in the last decade, but his performance was so good as Aemond, and so different from Osferth, much like Matt Smith, it never triggered that part of my brain watching him. And that's the trick with casting. But the trouble is, it's a very subjective thing, and not easy to do. A different viewer might feel the exact opposite to how I do. At the end of the day, it's the job of an actor, especially a good actor, to make the audience believe them as the character. When it comes to the most popular fan casts of Aegon, the idea of Henry Cavill is plagued by the same issues we just spoke about in terms of immersion and association, which the casting directors work so hard to mitigate. If anything, the idea of Cavill presents a bigger challenge than, say, Matt Smith, given his star power and current popularity. But despite being Superman and Geralt of Rivia, Cavill will always be Charles Brandon from the Tudors to me. While he was the best thing about The Witcher, and I was able to suspend my association with his other roles, it is still a big issue when casting such an important role as Aegon. I personally could never see Cavill as Aegon, despite how hard a lot of mainstream media has tried to push the idea. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have felt differently, but the reality is Cavill is too old to play Aegon at this stage of his life, during the Conquest. I just don't think Cavill could realistically pull off a man in his mid-20s at this point. That's why a less Hollywood actor makes a lot of sense. Someone in the same vein as Tom Glencarny or Ewan Mitchell. Plus the Hollywood aspect of it presents other issues, such as the kind of fee Cavill commands. I know many people were surprised he did The Witcher, but the key difference is it started off a passion project for him. That's why he may have been more willing to take a lower than normal fee than would be expected. And you also have to consider, would he even want to take the role? It wouldn't necessarily be a passion project for him like The Witcher was. Plus we know he's going to be busy with the Warhammer movies, which I would argue is an even bigger passion project for him than The Witcher was. But if you were going to cast Cavill in Aegon's Conquest, I could definitely see him perhaps playing an aged down Argilac the Arrogant, or maybe perhaps Howard the Black. I believe that if Cavill is ever to do any kind of a Song of Ice and Fire project, I think it could be a smaller role, such as Ian McShane was in Game of Thrones, an important role but more of a cameo. Katheryn Winnick as Visenya is again a very popular fan cast and has been for years. While not necessarily as much of a household name as Cavill, meaning the issue of association is less pronounced, Winnick as Visenya does also share some of the same issues as Cavill, but arguably, as much as I love her as an actress, the key reason I don't think she would be cast as Visenya is the fact that Visenya as a character is very similar to her character in Vikings, Lagertha. And don't get me wrong here, I can totally see it and see her as Visenya and understand why people wanted it. Both characters have a lot in common in terms of personality and their looks. That is inherently the issue, how similar the characters are. Winnick spent several years playing Lagertha. I think it's a fair question to speculate as to if she'd even want to play such a similar character again, and so soon. Like Cavill, I also think Winnick, at this point in her career, is too old to be playing Visenya during the Conquest. However, what I will say is this: if we ever get a TV show that delves into the Sons of the Dragon, covering the reigns of Aenys and Maegor, I definitely could see Winnick as an older Visenya. This situation reminds me greatly of the House of the Dragon fancasting when the show was first announced, and people began fancasting it. Everywhere you looked, Travis Fimmel, who played Ragnar Lothbrok in Vikings, was being cast as Daemon Targaryen. The amount of YouTube thumbnails about House of the Dragon I saw with his face on it was astonishing, kind of like with Henry Cavill and Aegon the Conqueror now. When I made a video defending Matt Smith's casting of Daemon, I pointed to the fact many may have been disappointed he was not Fimmel, despite the fact it was never a realistic prospect for the exact same reasons as Winnick. While Fimmel is only 3 years older than Matt Smith, I don't think age in Daemon's case was ever really going to be an issue, given how House of the Dragon changed most of the character ages anyway. But it's more so that Ragnar and Daemon, again, are very similar characters. The swaggering rogue prince. And for the same reasons I feel that Winnick might not have been keen on playing Visenya, I feel Fimmel might not have been keen to play a character like Daemon so soon after Ragnar. I think for the core cast of an Aegon's Conquest show, Aegon, Visenya, Rhaenys and Orys should be played by less mainstream actors, similar to how House of the Dragon handled its casting with the likes of Aegon, Aemon, Jace, Helena and Lucerys. But the truth is, you still do need bigger names to draw in a wider audience. For example, Sean Bean in Game of Thrones. Despite the disaster Bloodmoon was as a concept, the casting did seem very solid all around. But we don't know specifically who each actor cast was playing. You did have big names like Naomi Watts headlining the bill in a similar model to Sean Bean in Game of Thrones, and Paddy Considine and Matt Smith in House of the Dragon, and so on. Thus, a similar approach to Aegon's Conquest makes a lot of sense. Therefore, I can see a situation where much of the wider supporting cast could be made up of more headlining actors. Specifically, I think the Kings of the Kingdoms of Westeros would make a lot of sense. Big enough roles to warrant big names, but at the same time not part of that core main cast. So the likes of Argilac Durrandon, Lauren Lannister, Mern Gardner, Harren the Black and Torrhen Stark, should Aegon's Conquest get greenlit. Casting is going to be a tough task, given how many fans have built up this mental image of certain actors playing the characters for years now. But one thing HBO has always done really well, dating back to the likes of Rome, is picking a strong cast, and I see no reason why any future Game of Thrones spin-off would be any different. I'm not particularly attached to any casting ideas, and not particularly against any either. I'm open to see what HBO can come up with, but what I really want to know is what you guys think of all this. Could the likes of Cavill and Winnick still be able to pull off Aegon and Visenya, or would you rather the casting go a more low-key route? Who would you like to see cast? Not just an Aegon's Conquest spin-off, but any Game of Thrones spin-off in general.